person does not need years to understand you. A few minutes of watching your reactions is often enough. The hesitation in your voice, the way your mood changes after being ignored, the anger that appears when your ego feels threatened, the quiet need for reassurance hidden inside ordinary conversations. Human beings reveal themselves constantly without realizing it, and once someone understands what controls your emotions, they no longer need to fight you directly. They only need to trigger the right feeling at the right moment. That is how most people lose control of their lives. Not through force, but through emotional predictability. The Stoics warned about this long ago. They believed the fastest way to become weak is to let the outside world decide your inner state. Some people move through criticism, rejection, pressure, and chaos without breaking. Others collapse under a single opinion. The difference is rarely intelligence, it is inner discipline. Stoicism was never about suppressing emotion or pretending not to care. It was about learning how to remain steady when life tests your mind. Because the moment your peace depends entirely on validation, outcomes, or other people's behavior, your mind stops belonging fully to you. Anger feels certain, fear feels intelligent, insecurity disguises itself as awareness. And most people obey these emotions before they ever question them. Calmness has become rare in a world built on reaction. That is why it carries so much power. A steady person changes the atmosphere around them without saying much at all. Pressure stops working the same way on them. Manipulation loses its grip. Emotional chaos no longer pulls them in every direction, not because they feel less, but because they learned how to observe emotion without surrendering themselves to it. And once a person reaches that level of control, the world begins approaching them differently. Most people believe peace disappears when life becomes difficult, but that is rarely the moment it actually leaves them. Peace usually disappears much earlier, in smaller moments that seem insignificant at first. A delayed reply changes the atmosphere of the entire day. A careless remark stays in the mind longer than it should. Someone's approval creates confidence in the morning, then their distance removes it by night. Slowly, emotional stability becomes dependent on conditions outside the self. That dependency is subtle, but it changes everything. Once another person can influence your emotional state through small behaviors, they begin shaping your attention, your reactions, and eventually your decisions. This is why so many people feel exhausted even when nothing serious has happened. Their mind constantly adjusts to external signals, searching for reassurance, interpreting tones, and reacting to every shift in human behavior as though survival depends on it. The Stoics understood that the mind suffers most when it forgets the difference between what belongs to us and what belongs to the world. Another person's attitude belongs to them. Their approval belongs to them. Their emotional inconsistency belongs to them. Yet many people carry these things as if they were personal responsibilities. Someone becomes distant, and immediately the mind begins searching for explanations. Someone speaks with irritation, and the nervous system reacts as though danger has entered the room. Most reactions are automatic. That is why they feel so convincing. Emotion moves quickly, often before reason has time to speak. A person can know better intellectually and still become emotionally controlled by a situation, because awareness alone is not discipline. Discipline begins when observation interrupts impulse. It begins when you notice yourself reacting before the reaction fully takes over. This is where emotional influence quietly enters everyday life. Very few people are controlled through direct force. Most are controlled through emotional predictability. If someone knows praise makes you compliant, they will use praise. If they know silence creates anxiety in you, they will use distance. Small events create large internal reactions because the nervous system has been conditioned to treat emotional discomfort as immediate danger. That is why calmness often feels unnatural in the beginning. Slowing down feels unfamiliar to a person who has spent years reacting automatically. Stillness can feel uncomfortable because the mind has grown addicted to emotional movement. Yet this is exactly where growth begins. The moment you stop allowing every emotion to pull you into action, your attention starts returning to you. You become less available to manipulation, less controlled by appearances, and less dependent on constant reassurance. People notice this change quickly, even when nothing is said directly. A steady person changes the emotional atmosphere around them because composure carries a kind of silent resistance. It becomes harder to provoke them, harder to pressure them, and harder to lead them away from their center. Most people believe their emotions are telling them the truth, but emotions are often only reporting a temporary state of the mind. Anger feels certain, fear feels intelligent, insecurity disguises itself as awareness. Yet many emotional reactions are nothing more than fast interpretations created before reason has time to examine reality clearly. Someone speaks carelessly and irritation rises immediately. Someone else receives recognition and comparison enters the mind without permission. A small moment creates a large internal reaction, and because the feeling arrives quickly, people assume it must also be accurate. This is where many decisions lose clarity. The mind reacts first and reflects later. By the time understanding arrives, words have already been spoken, relationships have already shifted, and unnecessary damage has already been created. The Stoics understood that the first emotional impulse is natural, but they also understood that impulse does not deserve automatic obedience. There is an important difference between feeling something and becoming controlled by it. Most people never separate the two. They experience emotion and immediately turn it into behavior. Anger becomes speech, anxiety becomes retreat, ego becomes defensiveness. The process happens so quickly that it feels automatic, almost unavoidable, but this is exactly why emotional discipline matters. A person who cannot pause before reacting slowly loses authority over their own mind. They begin living according to emotional weather instead of deliberate judgment. Some days they are ruled by confidence, other days by fear. Their behavior changes constantly because their emotional state changes constantly. This creates instability, not only internally, but within every interaction they enter. Watch how quickly reactive people surrender their direction. A minor inconvenience ruins their concentration. A disagreement changes their entire mood. One unexpected comment can dominate their thoughts for hours. The external event may last only seconds, but the internal reaction continues long after the moment has passed. Calm people experience the same events, but they process them differently. Instead of immediately becoming the emotion, they observe it first. They allow the reaction to settle before deciding whether it deserves action at all. That pause is where self-command begins. Without it, behavior becomes mechanical. Someone provokes you, and irritation takes control. Someone praises you, and attachment begins immediately. Someone criticizes you, and insecurity starts searching for protection. The mind moves automatically toward emotional comfort and away from emotional discomfort, often without considering whether the reaction is useful. This is why emotionally reactive people are easier to manipulate. Their responses can be predicted. Their triggers become visible over time. Once another person understands what controls your emotions, they gain quiet influence over your decisions without needing direct authority. A person who slows down internally becomes much harder to influence externally. That calmness interrupts emotional momentum. It prevents other people from gaining instant access to your state of mind. Someone may still attempt to provoke you, pressure you, or pull you into emotional conflict, but the reaction they expect never fully arrives. Instead of immediate defensiveness, there is observation. Instead of emotional escalation, there is restraint. Manipulative behavior depends heavily on emotional reactions. Without visible reactions, manipulative people lose feedback. They cannot easily measure whether their tactics are working. The calm person becomes difficult to read because their emotions are no longer displayed impulsively for everyone around them to interpret. The moment observation becomes stronger than emotional interpretation, people begin looking different to you. Their behavior no longer feels random or deeply mysterious. Patterns start becoming visible beneath words, beneath gestures, beneath the image they try to present to the world. A person who constantly seeks attention is often searching for significance they do not feel internally. Someone who speaks with arrogance is often protecting insecurity more than expressing confidence. Even disrespect begins to look different when emotion stops distorting perception. Instead of immediately feeling wounded by another person's behavior, you begin asking what internal condition produced it. That small shift creates distance between your peace and the emotional instability of others. Without that distance, every careless action feels personal. Every withdrawal feels like rejection. Every disagreement feels like an attack on identity. Most suffering grows from personalization. The mind automatically centers itself inside every negative experience. Someone becomes cold, and the immediate assumption is that you did something wrong. Someone changes priorities, and the mind interprets it as abandonment. Yet people are often responding to struggles, fears, and desires that have little to do with you directly. Human beings carry internal conflicts everywhere they go. Stress changes behavior, fear changes behavior, ego changes behavior, insecurity changes behavior. A person can care about you and still act poorly because emotional maturity is not as common as people like to believe. Once this becomes clear, emotional reactions begin slowing down naturally, not because you stop caring, but because you stop turning every external action into a judgment of your worth. The Stoics believed wisdom begins when reality becomes more important than emotional comfort. Many disappointments are painful not because reality was cruel, but because expectation was unrealistic. People expect permanent consistency from emotional individuals. They expect loyalty from people driven mainly by convenience or validation. Then they feel shocked when behavior changes suddenly. But human behavior has always been unstable when it is disconnected from discipline. A person guided only by emotion becomes unpredictable because emotions themselves are unpredictable. Understanding this removes much of the confusion people carry through relationships and social interactions. You stop demanding impossible consistency from ungrounded minds. This awareness does not make you cynical. It makes you calmer. You stop idealizing human nature, and because of that, people lose the power to shock you so easily. You begin noticing what people repeatedly reveal through behavior instead of what they temporarily express through words. Patterns matter more than promises. A person's habits eventually expose their priorities regardless of what they claim publicly. Calm observation creates better judgment than emotional attachment because emotion often wants comforting stories while observation notices consistent behavior. Over time, this changes the quality of decisions you make about trust, attention, and emotional investment. There is less urgency in the way you interact with people now, less chasing, less forcing, less need to emotionally control outcomes. You begin allowing people to reveal themselves naturally instead of constantly seeking reassurance about where you stand with them. If this way of thinking brings clarity to something you've been feeling but never fully understood, consider subscribing. Not for noise or empty motivation, but for the kind of perspective that helps you think clearly, remain steady, and move through life with greater awareness in a world constantly trying to pull your mind in different directions. Watch how quickly reactive people surrender their direction. A minor inconvenience ruins their concentration. A disagreement changes their entire mood. One unexpected comment can dominate their thoughts for hours. The external event may last only seconds, but the internal reaction continues long after the moment has passed. That is the hidden cost of emotional impulsiveness. It extends suffering far beyond the original situation. The mind keeps replaying conversations, defending itself internally, imagining alternate outcomes, and searching for emotional resolution where none exists. As Epictetus said, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. Calm people experience the same events, but they process them differently. Instead of immediately becoming the emotion, they observe it first. They allow the reaction to settle before deciding whether it deserves action at all. This small delay changes everything because clarity often arrives only after emotion loses intensity. There is real strength in that pause, though most people underestimate it because it looks passive from the outside. In reality, the pause is where self-command begins. It is the moment where instinct stops leading and awareness starts participating. Without it, behavior becomes mechanical. Someone provokes you and irritation takes control. Someone praises you and attachment begins immediately. Someone criticizes you and insecurity starts searching for protection. The mind moves automatically toward emotional comfort and away from emotional discomfort, often without considering whether the reaction is useful. This is why emotional people are easier to manipulate. Their responses can be predicted. Their triggers become visible over time. Once another person understands what controls your emotions, they gain quiet influence over your decisions without needing direct authority. A person who slows down internally becomes much harder to influence externally. That calmness interrupts emotional momentum. It prevents other people from gaining instant access to your state of mind. Someone may still attempt to provoke you, pressure you, or pull you into emotional conflict, but the reaction they expect never fully arrives. Instead of immediate defensiveness, there is observation. Instead of emotional escalation, there is restraint. This changes the balance of interactions more than most people realize. Manipulative behavior depends heavily on emotional reactions. Without visible reactions, manipulative people lose feedback. They cannot easily measure whether their tactics are working. The calm person becomes difficult to read because their emotions are no longer being displayed impulsively for everyone around them to interpret. As awareness grows, perception begins changing in another important way. You start noticing how much human behavior is driven by unmanaged emotion. Many arguments are not about truth at all. They are emotional attempts to protect identity, pride, insecurity, or control. Many decisions that appear logical on the surface are actually reactions to fear, loneliness, envy, or the need for validation. Once this becomes visible, people stop appearing mysterious. Their behavior starts revealing the emotional patterns beneath it. This realization creates a different kind of patience. You stop reacting to every emotional display because you understand that many people are struggling with impulses they never learned to govern properly. That understanding does not make you weak or passive. It simply allows you to remain steady while others are being pulled in different directions by every emotion that enters their mind. The moment observation becomes stronger than emotional interpretation, people begin looking different to you. Their behavior no longer feels random or deeply mysterious. Patterns start becoming visible beneath words, beneath gestures, beneath the image they try to present to the world. As Carl Jung said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. A person who constantly seeks attention is often searching for significance they do not feel internally. Someone who speaks with arrogance is often protecting insecurity more than expressing confidence. Even disrespect begins to look different when emotion stops distorting perception. Instead of immediately feeling wounded by another person's behavior, you begin asking what internal condition produced it. That small shift creates distance between your peace and the emotional instability of others. Without that distance, every careless action feels personal. Every withdrawal feels like rejection. Every disagreement feels like an attack on identity. Most suffering grows from personalization. The mind automatically centers itself inside every negative experience. Someone becomes cold, and the immediate assumption is that you did something wrong. Someone changes priorities, and the mind interprets it as abandonment. Yet people are often responding to struggles, fears, and desires that have little to do with you directly. Human beings carry internal conflicts everywhere they go. Stress changes behavior. Fear changes behavior. Ego changes behavior. Insecurity changes behavior. A person can care about you and still act poorly because emotional maturity is not as common as people like to believe. Once this becomes clear, emotional reactions begin slowing down naturally. Not because you stop caring, but because you stop turning every external action into a judgment of your worth. The Stoics believed wisdom begins when reality becomes more important than emotional comfort. That idea changes the way disappointment is experienced. Many disappointments are painful, not because reality was cruel, but because expectation was unrealistic. People expect permanent consistency from emotional individuals. They expect loyalty from people who are driven mainly by convenience or validation. They expect maturity from minds still ruled by impulse. Then they feel shocked when behavior changes suddenly. But human behavior has always been unstable when it is disconnected from discipline. A person guided only by emotion becomes unpredictable because emotions themselves are unpredictable. Understanding this removes much of the confusion people carry through relationships, friendships, and social interactions. You stop demanding impossible consistency from ungrounded minds. As emotional interpretation weakens, observation becomes more precise. You begin noticing what people repeatedly reveal through behavior instead of what they temporarily express through words. Patterns matter more than promises. A person's habits eventually expose their priorities, regardless of what they claim publicly. Someone may speak about loyalty constantly while disappearing when circumstances become inconvenient. Another may speak very little while remaining reliable during difficult moments. This is why calm observation creates better judgment than emotional attachment. Emotion often wants to believe comforting stories. Observation notices consistent behavior. Over time, this changes the quality of decisions you make about trust, attention, and emotional investment. Many people give away access to themselves far too easily. They reveal their frustrations the moment pressure appears. They announce plans before those plans are stable. They expose insecurities while searching for reassurance, then wonder why they later feel emotionally vulnerable around certain people. Openness feels honest, so most assume more exposure automatically creates stronger connection, but exposure without discernment often creates the opposite effect. It gives other people information they have not earned responsibly. Human beings pay close attention to emotional patterns, even when they pretend not to. They notice what excites you, what discourages you, what makes you defensive, what makes you seek approval, and what causes emotional instability. Over time, those patterns become predictable, and predictability creates vulnerability because people can only influence reactions they understand clearly. Notice how uncertainty changes behavior. When people feel emotionally secure, they rarely need to explain every decision repeatedly. But when insecurity enters, speech increases. They defend themselves before anyone even accuses them. They seek reassurance before acting. They overclarify small things because they fear misunderstanding or rejection. Most oversharing is not confidence. It is emotional tension searching for relief. The problem is that emotional relief gained through excessive disclosure is temporary. Once everything is revealed too quickly, vulnerability increases while clarity decreases. Some people will use that information carelessly. Others will quietly adjust their behavior around it. A person who knows your emotional weak points no longer needs direct conflict to influence your state of mind. They only need to touch the right insecurity at the right moment. There is quiet strength in becoming less emotionally readable, not artificial mystery, not manipulation, just steadiness. A person who does not react dramatically becomes difficult to study. Others cannot easily determine what pressures them emotionally, what controls their decisions, or what triggers insecurity inside them. This creates uncertainty for manipulative people because manipulation depends heavily on predictable emotional movement. If someone knows criticism immediately destabilizes you, they will use criticism strategically. If they know praise controls your decisions, they will use approval strategically. But when emotional reactions become restrained and deliberate, access becomes limited. The manipulative person loses clarity about where your pressure points actually exist. They become more cautious because they cannot easily calculate the emotional effect of their behavior anymore. The Stoics understood that inner peace is not maintained by controlling external behavior. Trying to control everyone around you creates constant frustration because human beings are unstable by nature. Their moods shift, their priorities shift, their opinions shift. Peace becomes possible only when you reduce how much authority those shifts have over your internal condition. That requires boundaries around attention, emotion, and disclosure. It requires resisting the urge to constantly explain yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you anyway. It requires becoming comfortable with silence instead of treating silence as emotional danger. Many people speak too quickly because stillness feels uncomfortable. They rush to fill emotional gaps before reflection has time to appear. But reflection often protects the mind from unnecessary mistakes. Over time, restraint creates a different kind of confidence. Not loud confidence built on performance or attention, but quiet confidence rooted in self-governance. You no longer feel pressure to emotionally prove yourself constantly. You stop seeking understanding from every person you meet. Some people will misunderstand you regardless of explanation, and emotionally mature individuals eventually accept this without resentment. They stop exhausting themselves trying to manage public perception perfectly. Instead, they protect their energy carefully and allow actions to speak more consistently than emotional reactions. That shift changes relationships, conversations, and even internal thought patterns because the mind becomes less dependent on external interpretation. Eventually, you begin realizing that real stability comes from reducing emotional dependence altogether. The less emotionally attached you become to immediate approval, perfect outcomes, and constant reassurance, the more freedom enters your life. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Because perhaps the deepest form of vulnerability was never emotional openness alone, but the silent belief that your peace depended entirely on specific people, specific results, or specific forms of validation remaining permanently available to you. Fear becomes strongest wherever attachment becomes deepest. The mind clings tightly to whatever it believes it cannot lose, and the moment that attachment forms, emotional stability quietly begins weakening. A person who feels they must be accepted becomes vulnerable to rejection. A person who believes their worth depends entirely on success becomes emotionally controlled by failure. The same pattern appears everywhere: relationships, status, recognition, certainty. The more necessary something feels for your identity, the more power it gains over your emotional state. This is why people often lose themselves while trying to hold on to things they fear losing. Their decisions stop coming from clarity and start coming from emotional survival. They tolerate situations that damage their peace because uncertainty feels more frightening than discomfort. The Stoics warned against this kind of dependence constantly because they understood that emotional attachment to uncontrollable outcomes creates instability inside the mind long before external loss ever arrives. Many situations continue far beyond their healthy ending because attachment makes acceptance difficult. People force relationships that have already lost mutual effort. They remain loyal to environments that constantly drain them. They continue chasing approval from individuals who have already shown emotional inconsistency repeatedly, not because the situation is truly good for them, but because letting go feels like losing part of their identity. Emotional dependence creates blindness. Warning signs become easier to ignore when the mind is emotionally invested in preserving a specific outcome. Logic becomes weaker whenever attachment becomes stronger. The Stoics believed this is why inner discipline matters so deeply. Without it, people become controlled not by reality itself, but by their fear of reality changing. There is an important difference between caring deeply and depending completely. Many confuse the two. They believe detachment means becoming cold, disconnected, or emotionally distant from life. But healthy detachment is not emotional numbness. It is emotional independence. You still care, you still love, you still pursue goals with effort and sincerity. The difference is that your emotional foundation no longer collapses every time life refuses to cooperate immediately. You stop treating temporary outcomes as permanent definitions of your worth. Failure becomes information instead of identity. Rejection becomes redirection instead of destruction. That shift changes the way pressure affects you because fear loses much of its influence once you realize your inner state can survive disappointment. This is why emotionally independent people are often perceived as stronger, even when they say very little. They are harder to pressure because pressure works best against those who feel they cannot afford loss. A person terrified of rejection becomes easy to manipulate through approval. A person terrified of uncertainty becomes easy to manipulate through fear. But someone who has already accepted the possibility of discomfort becomes difficult to emotionally corner. They can listen without panic. They can walk away without emotional collapse. They can tolerate temporary disappointment without abandoning their principles. That steadiness changes every interaction because people instinctively recognize when emotional desperation is absent. The Stoics practiced preparing mentally for loss, not because they expected life to be cruel constantly, but because preparation weakens fear. A mind that accepts uncertainty becomes more stable during uncertainty. Most suffering comes from resistance to reality rather than reality itself. People exhaust themselves trying to emotionally guarantee outcomes that were never fully under their control to begin with. They want certainty in relationships, certainty in success, certainty in how others perceive them. Yet life rarely offers permanent certainty. Everything changes eventually. Circumstances shift, people shift, priorities shift. Emotional stability becomes impossible when peace depends entirely on preventing change from happening. As attachment weakens, a different kind of clarity appears. You stop chasing people who are comfortable losing you. You stop forcing timing that clearly is not aligned. You stop bargaining with your self-respect simply to avoid temporary loneliness or discomfort. There is less emotional panic inside decisions now because your identity is no longer constantly negotiating for survival through external outcomes. You begin approaching life with more patience, more flexibility, and more awareness of what truly deserves your energy. Ironically, this often improves relationships and opportunities rather than damaging them. People respond differently to grounded individuals because calmness removes pressure from interactions. Over time, emotional independence creates something unexpected. Space. Space to think clearly. Space to observe reality honestly. Space to choose actions carefully instead of reacting impulsively from fear. The mind becomes quieter because it is no longer constantly trying to secure itself through external conditions. And inside that quietness, another realization slowly begins forming. The less attached you become to proving yourself constantly, the less need you feel to announce your ambitions, explain your direction, or seek validation before your work is even complete. Something changes when the need for constant validation begins fading. The mind becomes quieter, not empty, not disconnected from ambition, but less desperate to prove itself publicly. Many people spend enormous amounts of energy trying to appear successful before they have actually built anything stable beneath the surface. They announce goals before discipline exists. They seek recognition before consistency exists. Attention becomes more important than growth itself, and slowly their focus shifts away from real progress toward performance. The Stoics warned against this kind of outward dependence because they understood how easily external approval can distract a person from inner development. A mind that constantly looks outward for recognition rarely develops deep stability inwardly. There is a reason calm people often speak less about their plans. They are no longer emotionally dependent on immediate applause. Their energy moves toward execution instead of explanation. While others are trying to convince the world of what they will become someday, they are quietly becoming it. This creates a very different relationship with ambition. Ambition no longer feels theatrical. It becomes disciplined, patient, and private. The need to constantly announce progress weakens because internal direction becomes more important than external reaction. That shift creates stronger focus because attention is no longer scattered across public perception. Instead of performing growth, they begin living it consistently. Most people underestimate how much energy is lost through unnecessary exposure. Every time plans are shared prematurely, outside opinions immediately begin influencing the process. Some people project doubt, others project competition, envy, or skepticism. Even supportive reactions can create pressure before real progress has been established. The mind becomes distracted by perception instead of grounded in action. This is why silent progress becomes powerful. It protects concentration. It preserves momentum. As Seneca wrote, "The man who suffers before it is necessary suffers more than is necessary." The Stoics believed discipline should be visible through actions over time, not through endless declarations about intention. A stable person understands that words alone create temporary impressions, while consistent behavior creates lasting credibility. As this understanding deepens, observation naturally increases. You begin speaking less because you realize how much can be learned through quiet attention alone. Most people reveal themselves constantly without intending to. Their insecurities appear in small reactions. Their priorities appear through repeated choices. Their emotional state appears through the way they speak about others. A quieter mind notices these details more clearly because it is no longer fully occupied with proving itself. Listening becomes more valuable than immediate expression. Reflection becomes more valuable than impulsive reaction. And strangely, this often creates stronger presence in conversations rather than weaker presence. Calm attention carries weight because it feels grounded and deliberate. There is also something psychologically unsettling about quiet competence. People trust it instinctively because it feels stable. Someone who constantly advertises their importance often creates doubt beneath the surface because excessive self-promotion usually reveals insecurity more than confidence. But a person who moves steadily without needing constant recognition creates a different impression entirely. Their confidence appears earned instead of performed. They do not need to dominate every room or win every argument, because their sense of self is no longer built entirely around external validation. This changes the emotional atmosphere around them. Others begin approaching them differently, often with more caution and more respect, because grounded individuals are difficult to emotionally destabilize. Over time, emotional restraint changes how conflict is experienced as well. The urge to participate in every disagreement weakens significantly. You begin realizing that many arguments are not seeking truth at all. They are emotional attempts to secure validation, superiority, or control. Entering every conflict only drains attention and disturbs clarity. Mature individuals learn to recognize which situations deserve energy and which situations only create emotional exhaustion. This does not mean avoiding all confrontation. Some situations require firmness and directness. But unnecessary emotional battles lose their appeal because peace becomes more valuable than temporary victories over opinion. The mind becomes more selective with attention. more careful with energy. Instead of reacting automatically to criticism, you begin evaluating whether the criticism deserves internal space at all. Some opinions are useful. Many are projections from emotionally unsettled people searching for conflict, attention, or significance. Once this becomes visible, emotional reactions naturally decrease. You stop defending yourself against every misunderstanding because you realize not every misunderstanding can be corrected through explanation. Some people are committed to seeing only what confirms their emotional perspective. Arguing endlessly with those individuals only pulls you away from your own center. Calm people understand this and protect their peace accordingly. This creates another important shift internally. Silence stops feeling uncomfortable. Many people speak excessively because stillness creates anxiety. They fear being misunderstood, overlooked, or emotionally disconnected if they are not constantly expressing themselves. But emotional maturity creates comfort with quietness. A person no longer feels pressure to fill every moment with explanation or reaction. They can sit with uncertainty without rushing to control perception immediately. That patience changes decision-making because impulsive emotional responses decrease significantly. Reflection gains more influence than urgency. As external noise loses authority over the mind, internal clarity becomes easier to maintain. You stop chasing approval from people who do not even understand themselves clearly. You stop seeking emotional certainty from unstable environments. There is less emotional chaos because attention is no longer scattered across endless reactions to external behavior. Instead, energy becomes focused on discipline, awareness, and meaningful action. The result is not emotional numbness, it is emotional steadiness. A steadiness that allows you to remain composed while others become consumed by distraction, conflict, and emotional excess. Eventually, this discipline evolves beyond simple self-control. It becomes a deeper form of inner structure, a way of moving through life without constantly being pulled away from yourself by every opinion, every emotional shift, and every external pressure surrounding you. Eventually, the discipline becomes something deeper than emotional control alone. It becomes inner sovereignty, a state where your mind no longer changes direction every time the outside world becomes unstable. Life still tests you, people still disappoint you, pressure still arrives without warning. But the difference is that external events stop deciding who you become internally. Pain may still enter your life, yet it no longer takes ownership of your identity. Criticism may still appear, but it no longer defines your value. Rejection may still hurt, but it no longer convinces you that your direction has lost meaning. The Stoics believed freedom begins at the moment the mind stops surrendering itself completely to circumstances outside its control. Most people never reach that state because it requires consistent discipline, and discipline is uncomfortable before it becomes liberating. The difficult part is not understanding these ideas intellectually. The difficult part is practicing them when emotions become intense. It is easy to speak calmly when life is predictable. Real discipline appears when disappointment arrives unexpectedly, when someone provokes you unfairly, when pressure begins trying to rush your decisions, or when uncertainty removes the emotional comfort you relied on previously. In those moments, the mind wants immediate relief. It wants reaction. It wants certainty. It wants emotional release. But emotional release and emotional wisdom are rarely the same thing. A person who governs themselves learns how to observe emotions without immediately becoming controlled by them. They allow anger to exist without letting anger take command. They allow fear to exist without allowing fear to make decisions for them. That separation changes the entire structure of the mind. Most people become whatever emotion is strongest in the moment. They become their frustration during conflict, their insecurity during rejection, their fear during uncertainty, their ego during criticism. The emotional state takes control of perception, speech, and behavior until clarity disappears completely. Then later, when emotion fades, regret appears quietly behind it. This cycle repeats constantly in people who never develop internal awareness. Once awareness becomes stronger than impulse, reactions begin slowing down naturally. The mind stops moving automatically toward every emotional trigger. Instead, there is observation first, reflection first, breathing space first. That small space between feeling and action eventually becomes one of the most powerful forms of freedom a person can develop. This does not make someone emotionally cold. In fact, emotionally grounded people often feel things very deeply. The difference is that they no longer allow every feeling to dominate their judgment instantly. They understand that emotions contain information, but not always truth. Fear can exaggerate danger. Anger can distort perception. Insecurity can create false conclusions about reality. Because of this, they become careful about reacting too quickly while emotionally charged. They learn that temporary emotions often create permanent consequences when left unchecked. Calmness becomes less about personality and more about self-respect. Protecting clarity becomes more important than winning emotional moments. As this steadiness develops, people begin responding to you differently, not always consciously, but instinctively. Emotional manipulators lose interest because reactive openings become harder to find. Pressure stops producing the same results it once did. Urgency loses much of its influence because your decisions are no longer entirely controlled by emotional discomfort. Someone may still try to provoke insecurity, guilt, or anger, but the emotional hooks no longer enter as deeply because your identity is no longer fully exposed to external control. This changes relationships, conversations, and even the emotional atmosphere around you. Calmness creates uncertainty in those who rely on emotional chaos to influence others. There is also a quiet confidence that begins forming beneath the surface, not loud confidence built on image or validation, but confidence rooted in self-trust. You begin trusting your ability to endure discomfort without collapsing emotionally. That trust changes the way uncertainty feels. Difficult situations still matter, but they stop feeling psychologically catastrophic. You realize that you can survive rejection without losing your worth. You can survive failure without losing your direction. You can survive misunderstanding without abandoning yourself in order to gain approval. The mind becomes more stable because it is no longer negotiating constantly for emotional safety through external conditions. The Stoics understood that true peace does not come from controlling the world around you. The world has always been unstable. People change, circumstances change, opinions change. Trying to emotionally secure permanent certainty from temporary conditions creates endless tension inside the mind. Real stability appears when your center stops, depending entirely on what the world gives or removes. This is why disciplined individuals often appear calmer during chaos. They are not free from emotion, they are simply less controlled by it. Their judgment remains active, while others are being consumed by reaction. That ability changes the quality of every decision they make because clarity survives pressure instead of disappearing beneath it. Over time, emotional resilience becomes natural rather than forced. Situations that once created panic now create observation. Situations that once triggered overthinking now create patience. The nervous system adapts to stillness instead of constantly craving emotional intensity. Even silence feels different now. It no longer feels empty or threatening. It becomes a place where thought settles clearly without needing immediate distraction or reassurance. That inner quietness allows perception to sharpen because the mind is no longer overwhelmed by endless emotional noise. Eventually, you understand that becoming untouchable was never about becoming feared, emotionless, or distant from life. It was about becoming internally steady enough that external chaos could no longer easily control your direction. The world will always contain pressure, temptation, manipulation, disappointment, and uncertainty. None of that disappears completely. What changes is your relationship with it. Your center no longer belongs to every opinion, every rejection, or every emotional shift around you. It belongs to your own judgment. And once a person reaches that level of inner stability, they move through life differently, slower to react, harder to provoke, more careful with energy, more deliberate with thought, calm without pretending, strong without announcing it. And in a world constantly trying to pull the mind in different directions, that quiet steadiness becomes a form of freedom very few people ever truly experience. The world will always test your mind. People will misunderstand you. Pressure will try to rush you. Emotions will try to pull you away from yourself. But the moment you learn how to remain steady through all of it, you become difficult to break, difficult to manipulate, and impossible to control completely. Real strength is not loud. It is calm. It is measured. It is the ability to keep your inner world stable while everything around you keeps changing. Thank you for being part of Stoic Journal. If this message stayed with you, take a moment and watch one of the videos on your screen right now. Keep building the kind of mind that remains clear under pressure, disciplined in chaos, and grounded in a world that constantly tries to shake.